So that kind of like raises a very larger question about like the viability. Does social networking make sense in general in a Web3 context or not? And that's a very interesting question. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode number 3 of the Mad Blocks podcast. I am one of your co-hosts. I am Chad Barraford. With me is my good friend, Preston Thornburg. And today is kind of a fun and interesting episode just because this is our first episode. We're actually doing a technical deep dive. The first two were kind of like high level, but the podcast about the industry. But this one's diving deep into an actual protocol. And for this one, we did Lens protocol. Why Lens? I don't really know the answer to that question, to be honest. I don't know if Preston has a good answer to it. I think it's just because like we had a conversation with somebody from Hive, which is a social networking protocol on Twitter. We kind of talked about this, and we kind of was like, let's dive into one of the social networking things. So we just picked Lens. We don't have an axe to grind with Lens or any particular reason for Lens. Just like we thought it was an interesting project, and then they're doing different than the rest of the industry, and it'd be worthwhile to dive into it and learn more about it. So Lens protocol. What is Lens protocol? Do you want to take this one or want me to take it?
Ooh, yeah. Let's have you start it, and I'll see where. Yeah,
where I miss it. All right,
you go ahead. Have fun.
Okay. So Lens protocol, what they're trying to accomplish as a project, from my understanding, and again, if we might get some things wrong about Lens protocol in this podcast, my apologies to Lens if that's the case. We did invite them to come onto the show with us. We reached out to them on multiple mediums, and email, Discord, and so on. We weren't able to get a response from them, so we would have loved to have one of the people on from Lens to join us and help us understand these things, but we could not get that for this particular episode. But so what is Lens protocol? So Lens protocol is trying to create like a Web3 social networking protocol, right? And one of the key components that it's trying to accomplish is by separating the data or the content of the protocol and the protocol itself. So the platform itself, I should say. So like hypothetically, if you were on Twitter and you spent 3 years building your following, you got 100,000 followers or whatever the hell the number is, and then all of a sudden Twitter deems you to be bad for some reason, whatever the hell that might be. They can ban you, they can remove your content, they can take it away from you. And I think part of the value proposition that Lens is trying to accomplish is saying that, hey, if you want to move your experience from platform A to platform B, because the data and the content is separate from the platform, you can just migrate all your stuff over.
No, and one of the things that's really, really cool about what they're talking about doing, which I'm sure that we'll dive into in a short bit, but this modular framework of this extensibility, right? So I could build something similar to a YouTube and piggyback off of the content that was originally created for this equivalent of a Twitter. And that's really, really cool. It allows you to implement these use cases that like, I don't think you can really do right now, right? Because Google probably doesn't share their data with other vendors and things of that nature. So that's pretty cool. It allows you to bring your friends with you. It allows you to bring your content, your achievements, right? Within a gaming kind of a perspective, this could be really interesting as well. And even from their FAQ, right, of the reasons that they need to exist are centralization, censorship, data ownership. So my ability to own and control my own data, the ability for me to say things and do things without worrying about an intermediate or a third party saying yes or no, and the ability for my data to persist into perpetuity should a server go down, right? This anti-centralization movement. So that's straight from their FAQ of like, why does Lens need to exist? That's at the heart of why they exist.
Yeah. One thing I actually really like of the Lens protocol from my own research is that like, if you build a dApp on top of Lens, you can pull from other dApps and inject them into your experience. So like, instead of building your own like DMing component to your app, you can just like pull in some other DM, module that somebody else created and just like suck it into your apps. So you don't actually have to like hand roll like every component of everything within your kind of experience for your user. You can pull in things if you want to, and you can like on your profile here, you can say, hey, I'm doing another thing over here where like people can pay me to make a video about their products, whatever. And you can like, hey, I think it's called Clip Me or Clip2 or something like this is like one of the names of these things. and you can like kind of embed it onto your profile, or like, oh, jump over here, and you can like, pay me $100 and I'll make a happy birthday video for you or something like this, right?
Yeah.
It's conceptually, I think that's really kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it also creates this whole economy or like a marketplace of widgets, which is really, really cool. It enables people to not only be content creators, but also you can be a code creator and aid the platform. So there's a lot of entry points into the system, which is really cool.
Yeah, I definitely like that. But then the question becomes like, this is what it does. This is the problem they're trying to solve. The question is now is like, do they solve it? Right? They're trying to create a web3 implementation of social networking websites or protocols, platforms, whatever you want to call them. Do they accomplish this task? Right? And one of the first things I want to kind of poke at just a little bit with you here was something you just mentioned a moment ago about like owning your own data, right? Because when you post on one of these platforms, you're not sending it to the platform itself. You are uploading this content someplace. And from my understanding, Lens Protocol is pretty agnostic about where that data is stored. It could be on chain, it could be on IPFS, it could be, on somebody's AWS, S3 bucket or something like this, like hosted, whatever. And so like that to me is one of the first things that kind of is like a red flag. Because if the point here is for people to own their own content and own their own data, well, if you're pushing it to somebody else, then they own it. It's like the same thing of like not your keys, not your crypto. If you don't hold your keys in your own possession, then it's not yours. It's somebody else's, and you have to ask their permission to interact with that data in one form or another. So if you put it up to like some AWS S3 bucket, well, unless that bucket is your property, then you don't own that data. That can be removed. That can be changed potentially. Like if you put it to an IPFS, you might say, oh, that's decentralized, right? But somebody has to pay money to maintain that data, and if it's not you, that data will probably eventually go away, and you've just lost your content another way. So for me, it's like, unless it's either on chain, like on the Polygon chain itself, where it's pretty much guaranteed to be, has that permanence in that data, or you run your own infrastructure. You run an S3 bucket, you run an IPFS node where you're holding your own data. Everything else is not accomplishing this task. Like, the only way to accomplish it is for people to hold their own data and run it themselves, not ask permission for somebody else to maintain it for them, especially when there's no economic incentive for them to do so.
Yeah, that's actually one thing I didn't fully understand about the design. Who decides where the data is stored? Is it the dApp provider?
That's a good question. I didn't really capture that either. My assumption is that
it did say that it supported. It was almost like it didn't care which way you went with the data, which kind of then if you wanted to build that as a modular little component, then how are you ensuring that I get the data? Is another part of that question too.
Yeah. I didn't quite grasp that part yet either. Too like, all I understood from what I was reading for the documentation that I read is that they're agnostic to it, but I'm not sure if it's chosen per user or chosen per dApp. That's actually a really good question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, next time, like eventually, if we do a good job, eventually we'll be able to get like guests to come in and just nerd out about things, because I do think that we have a lot of valid. I mean, hopefully, I have decent questions, right? We'll see.
Yeah.
But you did have a great point, and you had a great point of let's say that you're storing it in a local Postgres versus IPFS or something of that nature. Even within, obviously, someone has to serve that content. So. Yeah. How are the incentives being paid out for actually serving the content becomes another question. And on IPFS, right? Of like, yeah, you can go ahead and write the hash, something like that, and you will see on chain that this particular transaction occurred. But the content itself, if it's stored on IPFS, and if no one's either paying the bill or the tab to a content like a caching service, like a provider, which is Web2, not Web3. Or out of the goodwill of someone's heart, then where does that content go? And how did we just go about like solving this problem of a trustless ecosystem?
In order for it to be trustless, you have to be self-reliant. Like you can't rely on Daddy Warbucks, Daddy VC guy who's paying the bill for everything. That doesn't work that way. That's Web2. That's how they do in Web2 land. Is like Daddy, Warbucks, some VC pays huge amounts of money. Like Amazon was losing huge amounts of money every month for like fucking 10 years. because they just had somebody else paying for the bill. And they can do that in Web 2 world. But 3 world, where it's like, where it's self-sovereignty or where self-reliance, right? You have to be able to maintain your own data, right? And for most people, they can't run S3 buckets. Too technically complex. The most viable way might be to do like IPFS, and then you throw Filecoin on top of it, and then you pay via Filecoin to maintain that data. But then you're gonna have an ongoing cost that you're paying in Filecoin for every tweet and every Instagram pic or everything you upload. And then it becomes a question of like, do I really want to pay money to maintain this data for the next 10 years of this random tweet I said 6.5 years ago that means nothing today? So that kind of like raises a very larger question about like the viability in my mind. Does social networking make sense in general in a Web3 context or not? And that's a very interesting question.
Do you want to keep going down that piggy like thing, or do we want to skip to the fee structure and more components? We have so many things to talk about. So
I don't want to get too much into the greater thing of like social networking in general, just because I want this to be a specific episode about Lens personally. But yeah, let's move on to the next part of Lens. Like, what is another component of Lens that you discovered in your research?
So piggybacking off of your previous comment of like the purpose of Lens, and again, this is not to be hard on Lens. I hope that Lens blast me with tweets and they're like, dude, you're wrong, and I would love to read why. But the simple truth is, we are trying here to build a decentralized social media platform that that cannot be stopped or cannot be moderated. So one of the questions when we decided to do Lens right off the get-go was, okay, what happens when bad stuff gets put on chain or like onto IPFS or onto someone's S3 bucket or however the storage mechanism works, right? What happens? And who's going to step in and serve as like the governor? Or are we just saying, this is trustless, it's decentralized, and no one can do anything about it, and we'll filter at the dApp layer, and that's up to the app creator, which is a totally fine answer. Depending on how you feel about government, I don't think that Uncle Sam would be too kind to that, but I do believe that Lens is based out of the United States for the most part. So right off the get-go, the idea of like, anything goes kind of goes out the window. And so I did take just a little bit of time. I wanted to skim through the contracts and look certainly into the documentation that they had. I will say that a lot of their security content could use some beefing up. That's not a nitpick. It's just kind of, I actually had security questions and it's just not there, which is, I know that they're still in like an alpha or something. And it's also worth noting that neither myself nor Chad had access to Lens. So like, there's no, like, we didn't get to play with this thing. So this is all hyperbole, right? Or whatever the right word is. It's all theoretical stuff, just looking at the docs. And so in glancing at the documentation, there is an emergency governance function. And that function is owned by the OnlyGov, I believe it is group, or like attribute modifier. And that particular group is a Gnosis safe, or like that the privileges to that particular function or belong to a Gnosis safe contract, and that contract has 2 owners, so it takes 2 people to sign off. So right off the get-go, we're saying that this is like decentralized and trustless, and that we're using governance to do all these crazy things. I would argue that there's some to be desired on the governance front of like, these are really difficult problems to solve. And one thing that I despise about Web3 is that we say that theoretically, because we put it on the internet, we throw it across 100 servers, suddenly like we fixed all the problems. There's a reason that Twitter has spent a fortune, right, over the years of trying to moderate policy on content. It's the same reason that Facebook, like, these are really complicated problems. The day that you start getting the bad guys coming in, posting illegal content, malicious, hateful content, etc., there will be a governance process, right? So if we talk about censorship here and further FAQ, because centralized social media platforms have a history of censoring content that they deem offensive or controversial, this can stifle free speech and prevent users from sharing their ideas. One of my takeaway questions for Lens is like, okay, how did you change that? Because what I saw in the contracts and what I saw in the FAQs and what I saw from all the documentation, to be honest with you, was the same thing. Right. I didn't see an answer to this question. And that's not to say that like that they needed an answer to the question, but they kind of advertised that they had one, and I didn't see one.
Yeah, I kind of agree with this notion in general. Like, you haven't removed the problem. You just have you haven't solved it either. Like, you don't actually have not that I saw in the documentation, but like how you would approach differently than how Twitter approaches it, or YouTube or whatever. Like, you still have that issue to solve, and they're still going to be the ones moderating all this kind of stuff. And they have the ability unilaterally, these two individuals as part of the Lens protocol, can just remove the hell they want, whenever the hell they want, right? And the whole idea, like, as I was saying before about like how you can move your content and your followers from platform A to platform B, that's actually not actually true. Like, it's true in some circumstances where you just like, you got sick of this app, you don't like it anymore, and you want to try this new app that came out yesterday, it's really cool. That's true, sure. But if they decide to ban you, right, these two people, which they can, if they decide to ban you or ban your content, it does not move with you from platform A to platform B. It's just fucking gone, right? So part of the idea, they're like, oh, you can move your content, is like, that's true and that's false. It's actually not entirely clean yes there, which to me is like a kind of a red flag.
Yeah, that's a very difficult problem to solve.
Yes.
It's something that I don't think either of us take lightly. And that was one of the things that was so interesting about Lens, right? Is I was like, okay, this is a full-blown protocol layer. How are they handling misconduct? Are they doing it at the app layer or are they doing it at the protocol layer? And it sounds like here, from my understanding, Daddy says what Daddy says at the protocol layer. And if you piss off Daddy, not good. So don't do that.
I mean, to be fair, to argue on their side, just because we don't have a guest here, but like, is that their intention, from what I was reading, is that right now it's a multi-sig controlled by the Lens team itself. Two people can sign something off and the whole thing just happens. But the intention is to move this to a community process, like a community multi-sig. Now, I don't know what that really means personally, or what is community here? How is the community determined? Like, oftentimes DAOs are not really community. Like, they are community, but they're not governed by community. They're just governed by like 3 or 4 people in the end, because they have like, most of the tokens to be able to determine. Not to mention that only like 3% of people even vote, or 2% of people even vote within any DAO. So it's just like, there's a lot of questions about how that migration from their multi-sig to community multi-sig would actually happen, or what that would actually look like. And maybe we'll do like a follow-up episode, in a few months, whatever, and come back to it. This is something to be aware of, and I would honestly say it's something to be concerned about.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing on the governance front is that, and I know for a fact I'm going to misspeak, so hopefully it's not too bad of a misspeak. But I distinctly remembered, as I was like researching through some of the documentation, and I remembered seeing a Eat Bogota talk from like 6 months ago or something. And it was with Lit Protocol. And I'm a huge fan of what Lit Protocol is doing with programmable key pairs. But if memory serves, Lit Protocol also has centralization issues. And if I'm understanding this documentation correctly, Lit is being offloaded for a lot of the functionality of Lens. So that's another focal point of like, if we're talking about building out fully decentralized infrastructure, and we're making sure that no one has supreme commander sort of privileges over this entire ship, we need to be really honest about this dependency tree. And how do we mitigate those risks at every layer? So
very valid point. Like, in general, like, how people do content moderation on a platform like this is a very difficult, as you were saying, very difficult, very hard problem to solve. And what's really fascinating to me is that, like, if you were to just have a no moderation stance, whatever, everything goes on you. To me, that kind of reminds me of like chat roulette. Do you remember chat roulette from like many, many years ago? Do you know what I'm talking about? So for people who don't know, like, chat roulette was like the first web app where you could just like go to, and it would just pick a random person and just connect 2 people together on their video cams, right, on their web cameras, and you could just talk to some random person on some part of the world you don't even know, right? It's just random connected people to people. And it was super popular in the beginning. Everybody thought it was really fun and exciting and new. But very quickly it became a place where like people would just, basically every other person that you would connect to would just be a guy jerking off, like literally with his dick out, jerking off on the camera. And so that's like,
what the internet's for. Yeah,
that's what the internet's for. So like, if you have no moderation, then it becomes like naturally a place of like, well, dare I say, a cesspool, right? And then like nobody wants to use it because it's just a big a website where everybody's just a bunch of white guys jerking off, right? Like in a literal sense, in chat roulette's case, right? And so like you have to have some level of moderation, otherwise it just becomes like so dirty that nobody civilly wants to get in the same pool as this other guy who's jerking off next to him. And so you have to have some moderation. Then the question becomes, well, how do you do the moderation? And to be honest, from what I understand of Lens protocol, they haven't even really addressed this question. From what I can see from the documentary I've read, they don't even have a stance or an idea of like what is they would consider to be moderation and what's not, and what are the actual, like, culturally, what are they developing put within that community. I don't think I saw, and personally, it may say maybe I missed something, and again, people can correct me on Twitter or whatever, but like, I didn't see anything that insinuates like how they're actually addressing moderation other than these two guys get to choose everything. So one of the things I had noticed, which I thought was really interesting, was this idea of gasless transactions, right? Because
I love free. Free's good.
Free's great, right? So blockchains in general have generally gas or transaction fees, depending on which chain we're talking about. The EVM chains have gas, and Bitcoin has transaction fees. But the reason why they're there is a host of reasons, but one of the reasons why they're there is to make sure that you can't DOS the chain, right? If everything is free, you can just go ahead and like pulverize it with queries, and then just like the whole thing becomes barely usable, right? So they had this idea of doing gasless transactions. So to me, I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. Okay, how do you fight against maluse of this system? You know, how does it actually work? And so in going through the process, what I understand, which is really kind of crazy to me, is that in order to do gasless transactions, you have to open an application. And it's a written legal document that you yourself have to dox yourself, and they have to KYC your ass, get into a legal agreement with the Lens Protocol, like, company behind the thing, right? You have to pay them 200 Matic, and there's literally a PDF that you can download and, like, sign it. And in this PDF, like, you kind of, like, sign your life away. It's just like, you don't have an ability to sue us publicly. It could only be done through private, arbitration, this kind of stuff.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's like, it's just like, you can't even make a public statement about the situation you're in with the Lens Protocol. You have to do it privately, which is, to me, is just like nutty as all shit. And the result of that is really kind of something fascinating, because if Lens Protocol can pick which dApps have access to gasless transactions and which do not, based upon whatever arbitrary mechanism they choose to put in, they effectively have the ability to pick winners and losers in their platform. They can say, I don't like you. You're not a cool dApp, so we're not going to give you gasless transactions, and therefore everybody using your dApp has to pay money to use it, versus this other one over here, which is gasless transactions and free transactions, and they're much more likely to succeed because they're free to use versus the one that is not free, right? So then it becomes a question of like, is this thing even permissionless if the protocol itself, the people behind it, have an ability to pick winners and losers of which dApps are going to be successful and which dApps are not?
I have to assume that they have the absolute best intent with that, and that I have to make that assumption. However, you're definitely right of they could accidentally or inadvertently manipulate the economy to which they are saying that they're building and encouraging everyone to build on. The same is also true if I created a module and someone else created a module or something like that, and they basically did the same kind of a thing. They want to keep that marketplace kind of nice and tight, which I understand. But in doing so, you are kind of, I don't know. Again, it goes back to the question of like, these are really hard problems to solve. So
yeah, it's not permissionlessness at that point, right? We always talk about how it's not censorship resistant because they can moderate whatever data they want. They can do the hell they want. There's right now, there's, at least in this moment, there's no governance whatsoever on this process. It's not censorship resistant. It's not permissionlessness. These are major attributes, like some of the most important attributes of a decentralized system, whatever that system is. And so, like, to me, it doesn't feel like what they're building is Web3 at all. It's more like a Web2 peg in a Web3 hole, and it's just like doesn't really quite fit,
We call that Web5. That's what that is.
Maybe it's Web 5.
Yeah, no, I mean, dude, it's hard to disagree with what you're saying. So I think the part that you're more interested on that is a little bit different than what I'm more interested in. What I'm more interested in is from an offensive perspective. I can see, like, I would be very, very interested of the spam implications of this. So it is worth noting that this protocol does operate on top of Polygon, and so as long as Lens continues to pay the bill, right, they will be able to subsidize growth and subsidize users because it's free. Yep. I would be very, very interested of when that bill stops, if it ever does, how does that change user behavior? Because now me acting on your network costs me money. That's a use case that's very, very interesting because I don't think we have actually seen anyone solve that problem. I know Steam it back in the day. I can't remember. I don't think that you had to pay Steam, or maybe they gave you Steam when you joined or something like that. But that's a very interesting use case. And also another interesting thing that, of course, I love is that if you have a dApp that's whitelisted, I would be very curious. I did not take the time, so I'm certain that I'm incorrect here, but it would be very, very interesting to abuse those whitelisted front ends to conduct actions across the entire network for free of like, let's use it for spam, right? Like, why wouldn't you? And so anytime you have someone paying the bill, it just opens a lot of doors. I'm sure that these guys have a kick-ass security team. Like, I know I'm assuming that some of the Aave engineers have even worked on it as well. So I'm sure that that's nice and tight, but that's something that immediately comes to mind of like how I would be curious for more information on how that works.
Yeah, as long as somebody else is paying the bill, right, to allow gasless transactions, that is the Web2 mentality. That's how Web2 functions. Everything is free because somebody else is paying the bill. The only way to make it Web3, in my opinion, is to make it Web3, meaning that you pay for what you use, right? Now that becomes a problem because if I have to pay money every time I follow somebody, every time I like something, every time I retweet something, every time I post something, then the quantity of content, the quantity of interactions on this social networking site will be far less than if it was free.
Maybe that makes it way better, though, by the way.
But like
it might make it way better.
The argument people make about social networking in general is that its value is derived from its number of users or its content. Like n squared is the typical thing people refer to. Like, how valuable is this social networking site? It's relative to the number of active users on the site, n squared, blah, blah, blah. But in this scenario, because everything costs money, your end value will be far smaller. Therefore, the value of the network will be far lower as well. So you will never be able to create something as valuable as Twitter or Instagram or like something of these like large monsters in the space. It might work for some like niche kind of scenarios and niche use cases, but for like large scale adoption, massive adoption of social networking, it's just not going to work out. You can't subsidize. I mean, you can subsidize if you really want to, investors, blah, 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 but then you're not really doing Web3. Now you're just re-implementing the Web2 thing we've already seen 1,000 times before, and you're not really making any changes here.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, right, someone is still paying a bill. It's just that it is being paid by the creator of the platform, which is a little, it just creates different buckets, the privileged and the non-privileged right off the get-go.
Right.
So play nice. If you're on Lens, don't break the rules and get that free tweets.
Well, that's how they protect themselves from spam. It's the KYC process, right? If they didn't have KYC, then I can join up and I could just start like going crazy.
Well, as a user, I don't think you KYC. It's only if you were a dApp protocol or if you were a dApp that was attempting to enlist for the free transactions, correct? To be a relayer.
Correct. I think it's on a per dApp basis, not on purchases, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So this might be an interesting time to talk about the fee structure because this is actually, like how the engine goes vroom is very, very interesting on this one. And I guess we'll circle back to the previous thread of like, well, actually, let's knock that out now. So one way, theoretically, in the future that the protocol could actually generate fees, I would assume that it will, is this feature of paid or like premium subscribers, right? Which I know Twitter now does. I'm sure that Instagram or whatever else, TikTok, whatever kids are doing nowadays. I'm sure that everyone's doing it probably now. But what's interesting about that is that you could technically build into the contract of, okay, 20% of all proceeds, if you're selling premium content, go to the protocol. That could then be used to continue to subsidize the motor, vroom, vroom, and everyone keeps getting free shit. So theoretically, that could be a revenue model that I didn't see that in the documentation. If it is there, I may have missed it, but I would assume that they'll do that. Like it seems kind of easy to do.
Yep.
So let's get into presumably how being a user on Lens is, given that you nor I am a user. I would love an invite, by the way. You know, if anyone ever wants just a hater on the thing. Yeah, for sure. Send me one. But what's interesting about Lens, and it kind of makes you do some mental gymnastics a little bit, is that following and posts and things like that are all treated as NFTs, right? Which is interesting for a bunch of reasons to me. So one use case is that if I follow you, I'm actually minting an NFT of your Chad Barraford follower NFT, right? And we'll just call it that. And so now I am also a user of this community, right? It's like a micro DAO or something like that. Which presumably, if I've been a bad boy, I have to pay to do that. So that would kind of, well, I guess if the DApp, whoever's the bad boy in this scenario would have to pay, someone pays the shekels to get the thing so that I can now follow you. But what's interesting about that is that, and same is true of any transaction on chain. And what becomes interesting is that if I follow you, I get this NFT, and I was really hoping to get some of the security documentation stuff, because one of the ideas is like, if my feed is populated based on the NFTs that I have in my wallet, can I just follow a bunch of like morons and then ship you the NFTs and like flood you? Like, I don't know. I saw that there were some that, like, I don't know if these NFTs are signed or like how that works, but that would be kind of interesting.
I think one of the things that fights against that idea is that NFTs cost money. You have to, like, that's not free. That's not gasless, blah, blah, blah. That's paid. So every time you follow somebody, you have to pay money. So if you acquire an NFT and then send it to somebody else, I think you could do that, but you have to pay each time you do it.
For sure they have to be signed. I did see that there were a bunch of transaction types with like WIT-SIG. I didn't have a chance to go. There's like so many contracts and all sorts of stuff. I didn't have time to really dive that far into it. But yeah, it would just be kind of a cool little spam attack of like, if Vitalik was a member and I could just send him my NFT and suddenly Vitalik's following me.
You.
Like, what's up, dude? What's up, dude? It's like, and he's like one of one follower. That's kind of rad, you know? It definitely seems like a spam vector that I'm certain that their team's already accounted for. But that was something that was interesting.
Yeah.
Another one is the unfollowing. So, like, because it costs money to do anything, once the subsidies stop, then, like, I'd have to pay money to unfollow people. Granted, it's Matic, right? So we're talking about, it's like nothing, essentially. But, you know, with enough frequency, that's kind of it's an interesting use case. And lastly, so like, if you're a paid subscriber and I get content, so if we really think about what we're doing here, really more of a privacy standpoint, all of that data can be tracked back in the on-chain transactions, right? So for example, you and I are not users, but I sent you right before the show, like some content from someone's Lens profile, I guess, or whatever, just by finding, you know, the content on IPFS. And that's really, really interesting because, and presumably they have this solved somewhere in their documentation, but it would be very, very interesting, unless they're doing some mathematical kung fu, which I have some ideas for. If the content is stored in clear text on IPFS, then technically I could just write a script and never pay for my premium subscription and automatically just pull it and shove it, you know, and like, and I could throw it on my Twitter account for them. I don't know, like for free.
Yeah.
So that's the data privacy layer here is an interesting one.
What's fascinating there is that, like, if somebody has subscribers, blah, 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 you can pull their data and then repost it on like some other platform and just feed it.
Why not?
Why not? And then charge people for that subscription that you just like stole the content from this other person, whoever the other person is. Like, that's actually a really important thing that you brought up, I think, is that if you want to have a private experience on social networking, like my personal Instagram account is a private account, right? It's only, you know, I have to accept you to see my content. And in that particular case, it's really good because, like, I have a wife, I have a kid, we're posting photos with our friends and family, but we don't want the general world to see, you know, what we're doing or whatever, right? Perfectly valid use case for like privacy within the context of social media, right? And I don't see, as I haven't saw from the documentation what I read, that there's a viable methodology of having a private account on any of these platforms that I can think of.
I did not see any documentation about privacy at all.
I don't think I saw even the word privacy that I can recall anywhere.
I looked for security and I think I saw it twice. I really hope I'm not misspeaking. I should double check this before I say that, but I am pretty confident. Okay, so there's three things: dispatcher, non-management type data, and state change functions. But there's literally in their entire fucking code base and their entire goddamn documentation set, there's no security section.
Yeah.
Like, that might be a fucking problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, come on. Like, what, like, it's just, I don't know why it frustrates me so much, but it really does. Because, like, these are really hard problems to solve, and we're kind of just treating them as, like, you know, hogwash.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. for sure. One of the things that I found interesting here is that about their design is that they wanted to create a web2 experience in some sense, right? In the sense that, like, if you want to build a dApp, right, and a platform, blah, 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 and you come from the React world and, you know, or whatever, Vue.js, blah, 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 you build apps and you have, you know, RESTful APIs or GraphQL style APIs, whatever. They wanted to recreate that experience, so they've created an indexer, off-chain indexer, and that you can query with your app to get, like, the information about content and followers and, like, all the data that you're going to ingest, you know. But what's surprising to me, which kind of, like, drew me a little bit nutty, was that this API is closed source and it's only run by the team. So if you want to actually utilize the data, querying the chain directly isn't so viable because it's just not indexed in a way that's really usable. You have to use their indexer in many respects, right? Yeah, or just hand roll your own indexer somehow, some way. But, like, nobody's going to do that for obvious reasons. But, like, use their API, which is theirs and closed source and proprietary. And the idea about putting the word proprietary next to a Web3 project, to me, just is like red flag. And, like, because they're running the API, they can do whatever they want. So even if the community does not moderate through the community at multi-sig voting governance model that they're going to have at some point downstream, and they say, we're not going to, you know, remove this content from the platform, they can remove it from their API. So they still remain the ability to moderate however they want. And because they are literally a corporate entity that exists in the United States of America, that's the person they're signing a contract with when you get the gasless fees transactions, they are susceptible to government influence. To, hey, you have this picture of this, and Joe Biden doesn't like you talking about this embarrassing moment that happened, or whatever the fuck it might be, and they will have to oblige by it because it's closed source code that they're the ones that are the only providers of that data.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
I agree with everything you said.
That's completely crazy to me. I don't understand how this is even a thing. To be honest.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they did say that you don't have to use the API, but you would have to basically recreate it essentially from scratch, or it's like the data structure, or whatever it may be. But yeah, I'm really, really surprised by that, to be honest. Especially as a Web3 like social network.
Is somebody in the community building an open source version of this API somewhere somehow? Not to my knowledge. I didn't see it in my research, and hopefully somebody will build it at some point. But then, like, that's going to go. The problem with that at that point is that you lose gasless transactions, I believe, at that point. The only way you can get gas transactions through their API, not this new one that you rolled. So then all of a sudden you roll this new one, and most of the apps won't even fucking use it because it doesn't have the free version to be able to, like, have gasless transactions. That, again, it kind of, like, forces them to have full control over the entire system in many respects, right? Just to drive home how much control they have, and I know this is something you're very passionate about, proxy contracts.
Oh yeah, I mean, we can change the rules anytime we want in Web3.
This is something I actually want to drive in, and I know you're going to agree with me on this, but, like, everybody got pissed the other day about Ledger, right? Being able to pull your private key off of the secure enclave, blah, 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 and they're like, they couldn't do that. It was impossible. Now that they can do it, well, people got upset about it. And to me and to you, who are more technically, like, savvy people, kind of sat back and laughed a little bit, because it is their environment. It is their firmware. It is their code. Just because they can't do it now doesn't mean they can just upload new firmware that changes that behavior. Now they can pull your private key directly off the enclave, like the full mnemonic or the non-mnemonic, like pre-BIP39, whatever the fuck they want to call it. They can do that at any point they want to. And you have, because all the code is closed source, every time you install some firmware, you're just trusting that Ledger's, like, not doing something like this that you don't want to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And, you know, obviously the same is true in Web3 because there's someone hasn't built a service that I'm aware of yet. I should build that like basically keeps track of upgrade events, right? Yeah, the Ledger thing, like, I don't want to get too sidetracked. The Ledger thing, that's like, I could rant about how I feel about Web3. The Ledger event and people's reactions makes me legitimately want to leave Web3 forever.
because they're like just misinformed about like how this shit actually works.
Yeah, like I felt really, really bad for Ledger, to be honest. Absolute PR disaster.
Yes.
Yeah, really, really unfortunate. So I even made a tweet about it of like, what was it, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, like everyone suddenly became a fucking health expert and how vaccines work, which is hilarious because I don't know shit about vaccines, right? But suddenly everyone's a goddamn expert. And then like 4 months ago, suddenly everyone's a fucking language expert and AI expert, and they've been designing models for the past 10 years. They've got dual PhDs in it. Like everyone knows that large language models. Like, what are you, fucking stupid? You've never heard of a large language? And now suddenly everyone's a fucking firmware expert, right? It's the same thing all over again. And it's really frustrating. And like, you just kind of, all that I can do is just, try to do my best and just read more about Lens Protocol, just one day at a time.
Well, so similar to that, like Ledger has the ability to rewrite the rules at will to however the hell they want to change it. And anything that any assumptions you're making about how a Ledger, a device is governed or worked, blah, 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 none of that is guaranteed because they can change it to whatever the fuck they want. And the same is true for proxy contracts in general, depending upon how they're implemented. But in this particular case on Lens Protocol, that's the same case here because they can upgrade the contracts however they want, whenever they want, to change whatever rules they want without anybody being a part of that process other than two people on their multi-sig.
The funny thing is like that's literally how just the world works, and everyone was so upset about Ledger, and the simple truth is you trusted them a week ago and nothing's changed. Either you trust them or you don't trust them, and that's the game. Yep. And the same is true of 99.9% of projects in Web3, and you're either down with it or you're not. If you're not down with it, don't use Ethereum because that's literally what everyone's doing, and it's socially acceptable now. I hate it personally. I think it's a terrible idea. And I will give mad kudos to the teams that don't use them, right? Like Uniswap is one of them, for example. It always goes back to a talk that I saw of Andreas Antonopoulos like years ago at ETH Denver. And he talked about you can't versus you won't do something when Uncle Sam comes knocking on your door. The simple truth is if there is a way to change flow, to change content, to change rules of a game, because you have external pressures and external actors with their heel on your neck, and if you say you won't, that's called jail time. That's not good, right? So building in these back doors opens up susceptibility to, I don't give a fuck what you claim with rainbows and unicorns. None of it's true. What's true is when push comes to shove, what are you going to do? And it's not to pick on Lens. It's honestly pretty much everyone. So it's a narrative that like, it makes you question things every day.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with you on that. Absolutely.
So let's go into if you were to try to build something like a Lens and you were to try to do it from your perspective in a way that's more efficient or more ethical to the considerations of Web3 of like what we're actually trying to achieve. What different sorts of implementations would you use and what would the design look like as opposed to what it looks like here?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, first thing I would do is like get rid of all the proprietary shit. I mean, you can't do Web3 and have KYC. You can't do Web3 and have proprietary closed source code. Like, you just exclude yourself from that label immediately just by saying, hey, we're closed source and we're KYC'd and all these things. Get the fuck out of here with that horse shit. So first thing I do is basically get rid of the gasless transactions. I know that people love it. I know people enjoy it because it makes it more viable to be running the system, but you can't do gasless transactions and be Web3, right? You can't do that. It's like you either are Web3 or you're Web2, and you trying to straddle the middle of it. It's just like you just end up like severing the baby in half in a matter of speaking. Like it just doesn't make any sense to me logically. So like I say, get rid of the gasless transactions, open source your API, right? The Lens API, allow anybody to use it, right? If they want to use it.
Yep.
Get rid of the whole fucking KYCing people with the signing a document and 200 Matic, blah, blah, blah. That's all just dog shit. Do a better job with your proxy contracts. Now, I'll actually say is that like the better solution for the proxy contract is just not using the EVM. I know people are going to yell at me for this. The EVM, for the reasons that you were just talking about, how like 99 point something % of people are just using proxy contracts, which is so wrong in the context of like building a properly decentralized system. What's a better approach doing it, in my opinion at least, is just building a layer one via Polkadot, via Cosmos SDK, and then having the validators running the code and the validators update to this new version of this new code, which has these new changes, whatever the hell it is, and then allowing the validators to be the methodology of adopting a change or not. Just the way Bitcoin, you adopt a change or not by a simple majority of the hash rate adopting the new Bitcoin change, whatever the hell that might be. That's the cleanest and best way to maintain decentralization in a protocol like this. You throw things in the EVM world with a smart contract, and then you have this really complicated, difficult problem of like, well, how do we run this in a decentralized way? DAOs are not really decentralized because only 2% of people actually vote. You have the minority pushing around the majority. It's like the tail wagging the dog in a matter of speaking. You have proxy contracts, which is creates vast central points of centralization. Like, it's not very easy. It's easy to deploy an EVM smart contract, but it's not easy to run it in a decentralized way. And I don't think they've particularly figured that problem. I mean, other people have, like Uniswap has done some really interesting things that you mentioned that before. Like, and there's ways of doing proxy contracts that are better than others, although not perfect. But like, still, the cleanest way to create the most decentralized platform or product that you can, or protocol that you can, to me, is just creating a layer one itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not going to blast Ethereum. I would take a different spin at it. I can definitely see where you're coming from, and I don't disagree. I think what would be interesting is, someone that I really admire in the space tweeted the other day of that, just build what people love and then figure out like the hard parts later. I definitely disagree with this comment of like the design of consensus, the design of governance has to be like hammered out before you launch something like this, I think, because of the critical component to which all of the content will surround it. The fact that governance seems to be, from an outsider's perspective, very much an afterthought or a strap-on item of like, once it's running, we'll figure it out, makes me nervous about why would I use this over Twitter other than to just be with a bunch of other people with .eth addresses. Like, who gives a shit? Like, the content isn't going to be, without solving that problem of how do we handle when bad things happen. Oh, we're just going to use a multi-sig and it's going to eventually be used by governance. How? Like, how are you going to ensure that governance actually is effective? What sorts of metrics are you going to use? Like, how are you going to design an incentive structure to where people do the right thing for the network, for the content, and that liberals or fucking, the alt-right or whoever doesn't overrun this thing very quickly? And now you've just completely destroyed what you're trying to build anyway. By taking this like leapfrog approach, it makes me a little bit skeptical of where this goes in the future. I'd be surprised if it stays in a neutral, positive way. I see it being overrun by whatever the creators want to push, which is fine. And maybe that's the end goal. I don't know. I mean, what I will say in their defense is that I did see somewhere, I think I watched a couple technical talks that they gave. I forget who from their team, but it does sound like they mentioned that there were around already 200 applications built on top of Lens Protocol, which is actually pretty incredible given that I don't know anyone that has access. So maybe I just don't have cool friends, though. I don't know. I'm actually pretty confident I don't have cool friends.
I mean, I'd be curious about what defines as an app, and like, can I just write 5 lines of code and deploy it, and then that's it?
Hello world.
Hello world.
I call that an app.
I deployed an app, right? Like, and then also we want to see what the usage is of those things. Like what is the usage across all the 200 apps? What percentage of the traffic is going app? A, app B, app C, app D, app, and what is the Pareto curve of that? I mean, I'd be fascinated about that. That information wasn't available to me, at least in the research that I did, but maybe
I also would be curious, like, so I had another like funny idea. I'm certain that the security stuff is locked down. But it would be fun, just for the shits and giggles of like, what if you became, what if I built up a bot army and like just spam the shit out of the network, started creating a bunch of nonsense content, pushing it all to IPFS, just fucking mass create. So now I have 100,000 followers real quick, right? Because everything's subsidized, so who gives a shit, right? Right. And then I create a subscription-based NFT service or like a subscriber thing. And then I somehow manipulate people into actually paying for my content. And then I just rug pull them. And who gives a fuck? I'm not doing it anymore. Like there's no actual real content here. It's all bullshit.
Well, that's one thing with the gasless transaction is that not every transaction is a gasless transaction. It's only a subset of the transaction type. So posting content, for example, is gasless. Following is not.
Now, that's not to suggest that Lens isn't the best one. To be honest with you, I'm so busy with, and probably just like you, of like we live our lives. And so I'm sure that this is probably the best implementation. It's the most popular one from what I've heard. I don't know of any that are, Blue Sky,
Bigger.
I haven't looked into yet, but
Yeah. I would love to do a deep dive in Blue Sky. From what we don't get into it now, but like that looks like interesting just because Jack Dorsey's behind it. But it seems like it's lacking any kind of economic models of any kind. So it just seems like there's no incentive for anybody to do anything. I don't know how the thing would even stand on its own 2 feet. But any kind of final thoughts or final conclusions you want to make on Lens? Like, what's your high level overall viewpoint on Lens?
My overall viewpoint of Lens is that it actually looks really fucking cool. It actually looks rad. I think it looks really, really cool. The ability for me to pull content and push it into various front ends, like little containers of like, oh, this is my picture thing that's Instagram. Here's my video content, right? And like being able to like play gymnastics with my content and being able to drag and drop like via widgets and stuff. I think it's super, super cool. I think that I wish that they did a little bit more due diligence on some of the governance and some of the controlling factors. I would not call this trustless, decentralized social media. I wouldn't say it's close. And I would also say that doing truly trustless social media is really fucking hard. And I don't think anyone's doing it, to be fair. So that would be my takeaway. What's your takeaway?
I agree with you. I think what they're doing is interesting. And I think it's cool building a social media platform where people can build their own social media platforms on top of. I think that conceptually is a really interesting notion, really interesting idea. I actually kind of applaud that idea. But to call this Web3 or decentralized is I'm going to say it, it's a fucking joke. It's just, it is, man. Like, this is like one of my pet peeves of this industry as a whole is just the intellectual dishonesty, the massive quantity of intellect. You cannot, just because you have Polygon as a part of the process somewhere, does not make the thing decentralized. The fact is that they are the beginning and they are the end. They can pick whatever the hell they want. Like, if I were to build what they're building and re-implement it and do a completely, like, fuck Polygon and blockchains, everything, just do a completely, web2 mentality, which is all written with web servers and this kind of thing, it would be just as decentralized as what they built, because in the end, I would be the arbiter to determine what is going to happen and what is not going to happen on this platform. And it's the same over there. Like, they are the arbiters and figure out what is and is not. Just because there's a component where a database where they write some of their data to is on a blockchain does not create any sense of decentralization, because there's still a massive quantity of centralization in this product. So I like what they're trying to do. And I actually would like them to continue doing what they're doing. I'm not saying they should give up. I'm not saying they should whatever. And I'm not 100%. Saying buy or sell the token whenever the hell that's going to launch into the future. What I am saying is, I just wish you were just more honest about what it is you're building. You're running around talking about it as if it's some Web3 decentralized blah, blah, blah. And that's just complete horseshit to anybody who takes a deeper look into this thing. I wish you would just be more honest and say, we're building this thing. We have some Web3 components to it. We have some Web2 components to it. It's kind of a mixture of the two, and that's what we're building. Then I would say, great, awesome. Keep on going. Enjoy yourself, and maybe you'll get a huge following and very successful dApps, and I wish all the success to you. But just say what it is instead of yelling about this nonsense of being decentralized. Like, come on, this is horseshit.
But you get NFTs, dude. See, here's the thing, guys. Chad just doesn't get it. If you don't get an NFT, did it really happen? Did it really, though? That's what makes this Web3, Chad. Everything is fucking NFTs, bro.
If you're building a system and a component of it is decentralized, but the rest of it is centralized, that is not a decentralized system. If you order for it to be a decentralized system, it has to be centralized from beginning to the end. And if you don't accomplish that, what you built is not decentralized. I'm sorry. It's just not how this works. In the end, as Preston was saying earlier in the show, Uncle Sam can come knock on your door and remove any person, any content. You can remove even just NFTs that you buy to follow somebody. Those can be removed from you, not on chain, but they can remove you from the API, right? Just because you have an NFT does not give you access to the data that you would be getting by being a follower of somebody else, because their API can limit you, right?
I don't know.
The whole thing has.
I don't know if that's true. I don't know if
Why?
that part's true.
What did I
Well,
get wrong? What did I get wrong?
Well, we don't know because like we haven't messed with it, but I do believe that the data ownership, it's all written on chain. The API is essentially just a translation service, right? That takes content from Web2 rails and shoves it into Web3 rails. Agreed?
Yep.
But you can do the things about.
But you can't query the chain because the data is not structured in a way to be practical or usable for a UI. If the API was open source, I would change my tune, and I hope they make the API open source. But because the thing that everybody is talking to, because you're actually required to, and from a technical perspective, and even a monetary perspective, because that's how you get the gasless transactions. If you have to talk to their API, they don't care if you got the NFT to follow this guy or not. They can just filter that shit out if they want to.
They can filter you at the application layer, but the content and the privilege could still be queried via just going on chain and finding IPFS records. And maybe, honestly, that's what we should fucking build a front end that just goes right around the API of, hey, you got banned? No worries, bro. We got you. What content do you want?
Somebody should build that. I definitely won't be me because I got enough things that I'm building this moment. But but I think that would be where I'll build it. That if you want to help Lens Protocol become more decentralized, somebody should build that. Or even easier, Lens Protocol open sources their API. Do it,
friends. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there.
All right.
Cool.
I think that's the end of our episode. Unless you have anything last statements you want to make, or
no, all that I have is a little legal thingamajig is that ChatGPT helped me write. Nothing said on this episode or any episode of MadBlocks should be considered financial advice. The purpose of MadBlocks is to provide information that enables users to think more critically of all assets and platforms throughout the ecosystem. It is imperative to remember that in Web3, you are your own banker, and as such are responsible for anything you sign, click, buy, or interact with. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay Safu. Thank you for listening. I actually wrote that shit, not ChatGPT. That's why it's so good. That's why it's so good.
All right, man. Well, great. I appreciate that. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us on episode 3. We talked about Lens Protocol. We might have got a lot of things wrong. Happy to admit I got some things wrong. Preston's, I'm sure, is the same. Please tweet us or whatever. Let us know what we got wrong, so we can learn and grow from the experience. Thanks, everybody.